Hi everyone, welcome to Naveen Connect, where spirituality meets the messy but beautiful reality of being human. I'm Jean, and as always, I'm here with my fantastic co-host, Humphrey.
Thanks, Jean. Super excited for today's conversation. The first in our two-part exploration of Yoruba and Ifa spiritual traditions. These ancient practices from West Africa offer some of the most sophisticated spiritual frameworks ever developed, yet many of us know so little about them. We got two incredible guests today. First, we have Baba Jean Jerome Baudry, a practicing Babalao or priest of Yoruba and Ifa spirituality, and the co-founder and president of the Consejo Cultural Yoruba de Canadá. And with us as well is Dr. Ayodeji Ogunnaike, assistant professor of African religions at McGill University, with a PhD from Harvard, who has extensively studied Ifa divination with a high priest in Nigeria. In this first part, we'll explore the divine hierarchy, core principles of Yoruba and Ifa spirituality, and how this tradition views a relationship with the divine. Then in part two, we'll look at how these ancient insights can guide us through the remainder of 2025. Welcome, gentlemen, to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
All
right. So let's kick things off by unpacking Yoruba and Ifa spirituality. So for the folks that are new to this, Baba Jean Jerome, as a practicing Babalao, can you break down the core principles?
Thank you very much for the question, Humphrey. And hello, a warm hello from Canada to everyone who's listening to this podcast. I like to define Ifa Orisha practice as four pillars. First thing is that one of the first pillars of Ifa Orisha is that Ifa and Orisha believe in one creator divinity, or what some call Olodumare, who was the one who created and gave the task of expanding his creation to the Irumale, or divine beings, and as well as the Orishas and other spirits. So the first pillar is Olodumare, so monotheistic, in the sense that they believe there's one supreme divinity or God. Secondly, the concept of the ancestors, Egungun, understanding that we are a part of a long chain of beings that have been on Earth and have lessons to pass on from one generation to another, in terms of the teachings and the lessons we need to learn on this plane, which the Yoruba define this existence, or this Aye, as the marketplace, a place we're here to visit, before we go back to our true home in the spirit world, Oru. The other major pillar is the concept of Ori, the concept of destiny, that every human being, every being has a destiny, a unique destiny, which they choose in heaven before they come to the marketplace. And Ifa is primarily interested in helping people to rediscover what was the destiny they chose in heaven, and guide them in their paths and in the road here on earth. And the fourth pillar being the concept of divine beings, Irumole, Orisha, the chosen head, where the spirituality of divine beings is integral into the fabric of creation, but also the everyday life of human beings. And wrapping all of that together is the Ifa divination system, which basically allows us to have a two-way, a bi-directional conversation with the spirit world and the divine.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So you mentioned a couple things that, in my mind, are clearly, based on my knowledge, are differences compared to other religions. But if you could, in your own words, how would you say Yoruba and Ifa differs from other spiritual systems that some of our listeners might be familiar with?
So what Ifa basically differentiates itself from other belief systems, and like Christianity, Islam, or other modalities of belief, by its divination system, the ability to have a conversation, a dialogue with the divine realm, and be able to have not just prayer and hoping to see a sign, a miracle, or some sort of manifestation, but actually having real hard data that comes back and helps inform a decision or enlighten a situation that the person may be going through, or help them put them back on the right path in terms of what they chose in heaven. Right. If they're dealing with crises or other challenges in a very complicated and difficult world sometimes.
Interesting. So would it be fair to say it's sort of like having a two-way communication, like you just said?
That's right.
It's just not just sitting there praying or hoping for something and putting it out to the universe, but you're actually getting an answer.
Absolutely, and the Ifa is, in a sense, is very factual in the sense that when you have a divination with Ifa, when you're looking at a situation, Ifa is cognizant of both everything that deals with the spiritual realm, but also things that deal with the mundane world and the material world. So Ifa is not fanatic in the sense of saying everything is a spiritual phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So many times Ifa will speak to health issues, will speak to social issues, will speak to mental health issues, and understanding and discerning what part or role the spirituality plays, but what role other disciplines or other professions like doctors can play in terms of the overall health of an individual or their success in terms of their life and their prosperity and their abundance and the taking care of their family.
Very good, very good. So more of a holistic approach to dealing with the person.
Absolutely.
Great.
Professor Deji, in 2005, UNESCO recognized Ifa divination as an intangible heritage, highlighting its global cultural impact. Your work explores its spread through traditions like Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé. How did Yoruba spirituality adapt across regions while preserving its core identity?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that fascinates a lot of people because, the worship of the Orisha, Yoruba deities, if you think of it as a religion, is one of the most widespread in the world, and it's practiced far beyond. There are arguably far more practitioners outside of the religious homeland than there actually are there, which is a very unique thing for a lot of religious traditions, but especially those from Africa. There are no others from Africa that are quite as widespread. So there's something very unique and kind of interesting there that's fascinated practitioners, scholars, the general public for quite a long time. And I think part of the heart of it, it actually relates to the answer that Baba Jean Jerome gave us earlier. It's that it's because it's so attuned to the particular needs and circumstances of people. Mm-hmm. Whatever the social, medical, political realities of practitioners are, it responds directly to them. And I think its ability to be in dialogue with lived experience makes it readily adaptable to whatever circumstances you might have or wherever it finds itself. So as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, especially in the 19th century, there's a large number of Yoruba people who were brought to a number of different places in the Americas. And there they brought the worship of their Orisha with them, but most people usually wouldn't have been devoted to more than just a handful of Orisha from their particular area in what's now Nigeria or Yoruba land. And so in diaspora, they got kind of reconfigured and brought together. And they had, in some ways, actually a broader pantheon of Orisha than they would have had in their more isolated or regionally prescribed areas in the homeland. But they still preserved the kind of specificity of the particular ways that they would have worshipped them. There are elements of it that are very much heavily influenced by that history. And it's something you have to kind of contend with. But personally, I see it actually as a bit of a continuity of indigenous Yoruba principles of responding to the situation you find yourself in, responding to the needs of the people who are practicing it in real time. And even if you travel around Yoruba land today, you'll experience and see that diversity in regions and across different ritual houses and communities and things like that. So I tend to interpret it more as just, it's like a plant taking root in new soil and then growing in a slightly different way because it's being fed by different things. So focusing more on the process of how you respond to things and what you can do with that new input, rather than a fixed product, right? And like it looks like this in all cases across time and space, but people have different kinds of opinions about that. A very interesting thing is kind of more recently in the late 20th century, and then especially now in the 21st century, there's been increased contact between the diaspora and African communities and traditions, and then also kind of a further global spread of it. So beyond the areas in Latin America and the Caribbean where it was spread, we have what people sometimes call second diasporas. So Brazilians took candomblé to Lisbon and Italy, and you have Cubans and Puerto Ricans who brought it to the United States and to other places in Europe, and you'll find practitioners in Australia and Japan and all over the place. And so it's really spreading across the world. It's very difficult now to find a country where there are no practitioners of Yoruba religion, and it's constantly evolving. The internet has become a huge, huge hub of people sharing information, rituals, mythology, all of that kind of thing. So it's changing a lot all the time, and it's very, very dynamic. So it's a great question.
Well, I have a follow-up question. How many Orishas are there? And then is the Orisha, is Olodumare an Orisha as well? Or is Olodumare the God or the creator, and how do they differ?
Yeah, so Olodumare or Olarum is the creator, the supreme being, God. And just as Baba Jean Jerome explained, you could think of it very much as a monotheistic system. There's a belief in one supreme God. Underneath the supreme being or Olodumare God, there are the number of spiritual beings. Some people call them ministers, to translate it into English. Some people usually will say gods or goddesses, deities. I know people as well who say they're kind of more like prophetic figures, so something more akin to Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad or Moses or something like that. But they're spiritual intermediaries between people and Olodumare. And the number of them is it's a great question. Depends on who you ask. People will say they're either 201, 401, 1601, but it's just a big number.
That's a big range.
Yoruba society, 200 is like a stand-in number for a ton, a lot, a whole bunch. So you get a whole bunch, and then there's one more. And the idea there is because the system always adapts to the needs of the world, right? Like a kind of human existence on this plane in Aye as opposed to Orun, right, or heaven. New deities, new Orisha can come into being. And they're adopted sometimes even from neighboring groups as you encounter them. There's a long history of that kind of thing happening. And then if their cosmic domain no longer really affects people's lives that much, they might fall out of use. And so one might fade away, but then new ones will come into being. And so there's no fixed pantheon. You can get new ones, old ones might tend to recede, but there's a potentially infinite number of them.
That's extremely interesting.
That leaves me with more questions, though, especially for Baba, because Baba Jean Jerome, if there's new Orishas that can come into existence, as you're doing, let's say, Ifa divination to help an individual find their destiny in which Orisha they are working with, how do you figure that out?
It's an excellent question. So, I mean, again, in terms of a base number, usually the number 601, again, the plus one concept of everything plus one.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of things that come into play. Number one is the Orishas are, whether it be 601, 401, whatever the number is, they're usually categorized in spirits on the left, spirits on the right. Olosi, Otun, Olosi, or Osi, meaning that the ones on the left are considered to be harsher, right? In other words, they're not evil, but they're considered to be more harsh in terms of their interactions with human beings and the human condition.
Okay.
The ones on the right are considered to be more benefic, more peaceful, more pro, they let more things sort of pass in terms of the human condition, and they empathize more in a sense, perhaps. But as Professor mentioned, many of those Orisha that constitute that number have existed and have been worshipped more or less over hundreds or thousands of years.
Right.
And they represent an amalgam and a manifestation of spirits, not just from West Africa, but from other cultures that were where there was an interaction with, either Bedouin tribes or tribe of the Fulani, the Hausa, and all that came into the area, or other immigrations that came before them. The very arrival of, in the history of the Yoruba, as believed, the arrival of Oduduwa into Ife, right, brought a pantheon or a group of spirits that they represented and they work with, which through we call it the Yoruba way, they found peace, and through marriage and through adoption and respect, they've formed societies to help find balance and equilibrium, and began to worship and incorporate those spirits within the pantheon. The way that Ifa deals with it is Ifa, within the oral tradition, in a sense that was passed on for hundreds of years. In the last 200 years, more or less, there's been an effort to codify. Even in the Odu's Ifa, there's mentioning of codifying, because Ifa said, the Babalaos, there's a limit, to one person's ability to recollect, and also from a standpoint of preserving the tradition and being able to pass it on in terms of the basic constructs, and also the knowledge about the characteristics and the nature of different Orisha. They began to be codified. So hence the birth of the encyclopedias of Ifa in the Afro-Cuban traditions, which are multi-volume editions, which I've always said, if you actually took all of even the written work, and if you codified the remaining oral work, the combined corpus of Ifa in its 256 odus or signs would represent 10 Qurans put together, something like that, right? In terms of the volume of data, that is captured in those odu, and organized in terms of distinct historical and spiritual experiences over the millennia, and over different peoples and over different lands. Right? And Ifa says in the sign Oyikuno Kanran that the memory of the ancestors is codified in the Odus of Ifa, right? And in the standpoint of being Orisha, again, Orisha being chosen Ori, the concept of an Ori or a destiny that was privileged and that did exceptional things and was able to ascend to the status of being a divine being, an Orisha. There are many examples of that, of later adoptions of spirits into the pantheon, and there's always room for more to be adopted in the future, as humanity is exposed to different spiritual beings and different spiritual archetypes.
How does that help, Jean? Does that?
Yeah, it
opens a lot more questions.
Well, that's what we're here for, right?
So there's a trend in sort of the answers, right? So it seems like Ifa, so the Yoruba tradition, it's for the individual to help him a individual, but it's also flexible, right? So if something that's coming up in the answers is that it's flexible and adaptable to whatever's happening, whatever stage humanity's at. So that probably explains that there's a growing interest in these traditions in the Western countries. So the Western countries are starting to get more interested in that, and as they do, the new generations, right? They go to the internet, or they try to do quick finds on what it is. They do a quick research, and typically that brings misconceptions, right? Because they don't learn everything. They just read a couple excerpts, and that's what they take. So, Baba Jean Jerome, to you, what are some of the misconceptions that you most often encounter in your interactions, and what would you like people to understand about Ifa Orisha traditions that would, eliminate those misconceptions?
How long do we have?
As much time as you honestly as much time. No, but I think this is a very important point. I think this is something that it's critical.
It is. And an earlier conversation with the professor and with Jean as well, and on a day-to-day basis, the biggest challenge is one of being able to practice your belief system, your spiritual belief system, and understand it in its entirety without all the misinformation or disinformation. The usual suspects or the low-hanging fruit is the first, qualification of Ifa Orisha by either certain Christian groups or Islamic groups as being something what they define as demonic, something evil, something where you're doing witchcraft, without fully understanding, the depth of the belief system, how old the belief system is, and how relevant the belief system is across any religion or any monotheistic religion. Ifa Orisha really is almost a companion to humanity to help them to remember what they chose in heaven and lead the most balanced and best life they can for themselves, for their children, their family, and their community, and to pass on those traditions in a healthy way, and to respect nature, to respect the divine, to respect themselves as first and foremost, and to be able to do so without fear of persecution, slavery, or any type of legal problems and so forth. So the biggest problem is people tend to hate on or distrust what they don't understand. Right. And Ifa's sort of principles and moral compass are one of, preserving life, having, abundance, being able to have children, be able to have, a good spiritual life, and be able to interact in a positive way with your community, your family, and society in general. And those values are at the core of everything that a Baba or Orisha does, right? But extending that family or that community to mean the planet, to mean nature itself, and the spirit world, right? We're all part of one extended family, if you will. But that concept is lost because the moment in many other texts and everything else, the aspect of divination is thought to be like soothsaying or trying to draw lots or occult and all that occult knowledge. Ifa has an enormous corpus accumulated from Onishigun and from Osinists that deal with pharmacology. Right, the idea of the use of plants and everything else, and use of plants for healing and for everything else. But like everything else, that knowledge is oftentimes should be used for good, but sometimes it can be abused. Right, not very much the same way that doctors can save lives or doctors can be used as instruments to take life. Right, but the idea is understanding that the mission as Babalaos, we swear as part of our oath to Olodumare and to Ifa that we're here to help mend a broken world, to heal and to save humanity, right? So we try to believe that that the hand that saves should not be the one that destroys, right? But that concept and that oversimplification and saying, oh, you're doing something occult, and the misunderstanding of the Orisha's role and function and their dependency, or basically their filiality to Olodumare, to the Creator, and how that cosmos works and how the spirit world works, makes them characterize things, and Hollywood hasn't helped in terms of sensationalizing and categorizing things as demonic or evil or witchcraft and so forth. So if it were to communicate something to everyone, not just people who follow Ifa Orisha, but to understand that the Ifa Orisha, the aggregate family of Ifa Orisha and its beliefs have existed for hundreds or thousands of years, and right now today in its totality, it represents over 100 million adepts worldwide and represents the sixth largest belief system or religion in the world when you look at all of the different lineages and modalities put together. So I think it is worthy. The first thing would be worthy of respect, the same respect afforded to Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, or any other world faith.
It's interesting because when we started and you described the four core principles, one of the things that kind of was very eye-opening for, I'm sure for our listeners, is like the concept of the matter, right? Like the concept of one God, one creator, which I don't think people understand. I don't think people think of the Orishas, and that's as you mentioned, the image that Hollywood and movies have put in there. Another misconception that I think we've heard, we've seen a lot, or at least that I'm aware of, and I'm interested to get your take on, it's on the, sacrifices of the Abo, right? Like, so the Abos, because they're portrayed in movies and things as something demonic and something, killing. But if we, my experience, if you look at other religions, they are similar rituals that are done for other reasons, and they're not considered demonic. So as a Babalao, how would you describe an Abo, or the purpose of that, and why people should be not worried or not have the misconception of it being demonic?
Excellent question. So Ebo means sacrifice, but sacrifice is not always etutu or blood sacrifice, right? The idea of sacrifice, sometimes sacrifice, and that's why I love Ifa, because Ifa is not always a one-stop shop, one solution, or one-size-fits-all approach, right? Ifa is very individualistic, based on the individual's chosen destiny and what helps them. What is the medicine, or the recipe, or the prescription that brings them back into balance? And when we say, the person is Ide, or we talk about things about Iwapele, is not just good character in a simple moralistic standpoint. It is a character that is in alignment and balance with its destiny.
Got it.
That is fundamental, very much like in Hinduism, in Buddhism, or in Taoism, the idea of yin and yang, the aspect of equilibrium. When the person is in equilibrium, person can't be all good, the person can't be all bad.
Right.
The secret is in equilibrium, right? When the person is in alignment, in equilibrium with their destiny, that is when that's what we strive for. Now, the recipe or the prescription to get there can involve, offerings of, like in any religion. It could be different fruits, foods, prayers, adura. It can be also a sacrifice in terms of change of character, right? In other words, modifying your behavior, modifying your character, right? It's like the typical old joke, and I'm dating myself here. I'm 53. Doctor, every time I go like this, my arm hurts. And the doctor said, well, stop doing that with your arm, and your arm won't hurt, right? I don't have to kill a cow to solve that problem, right? But the idea is that the idea of sacrifice, when it comes to blood sacrifice, which is really the issue people have, especially people that have defend animals and believe in animal welfare and all that, which I respect. But one of the key things is that Ifa cannot take a life or make a sacrifice of an animal without the permission of Ifa. We don't do it for sport. We don't do it for fun. We take no pleasure in it. And we, as Babalaos, are held accountable once we leave this world by the very spirits and souls of the animals that we took. Did you kill me ethically? Did you kill me by instruction of Ifa? Did you do the proper rites and rituals and prayers so that my spirit would elevate, but at the same time that the person would receive the healing of my sacrifice? Right? And usually, again, I say to people many times as clients or as godchildren, I take no pleasure in having to sacrifice them, but if Ifa prescribes it, then the number one thing is make the sacrifice count. So if you're in a situation because of a behavior which you need to modify, make the modifications of behavior so you don't fall into the same situation. I do not like to kill animals in vain, right? But if they follow the recipe of Ifa, if they have the behavioral changes that they require, and you do the sacrifice, the idea is a spiritual construct of a life for a life. The animal is giving up its life so that the person can save their life or avert like a serious illness, a serious catastrophe or illness, right? And there are odus of Ifa which talk about where at first, Iroso Yeku, for instance, where death only knew and only fed on human beings, only fed on humanity. And it was allowed that through divination that a substitute had to be put because the human population was diminishing, and that a substitute had to be found to take the place or take a life for a life to maintain the equilibrium in nature. And that's when animal sacrifice, the animal was first sacrificed to be able to allow for the preservation of human life and a balance. And I say to many people, again, we don't as a society, whether it be Canada, United States, or England, or Europe in general, we don't give too much thought or second thought to the consumption of meat, whether it be poultry or meat from cows or pork, in terms of how they're many times very inhumanely kept and slaughtered in slaughterhouses, right? Yeah. When we do sacrifice, it is a sacred act. In Nigeria, many times, and in West Africa and in Benin, when you sacrifice to a Vodou or you sacrifice to an Orisha, that the energy, the blood, and the prayers go to energize the potentiality of the Orisha or the Vodou to help you and to take away a curse or to take away an illness or to take away a situation from the individual. But then the meat is many times consumed by the community. It's cooked and everything else. So very much, and not too distinct from Islam, when they do halal, right? They make sacrifice. They do it in an ethical way. And, halal is now, sometimes the rave in terms of people going to supermarkets and all that and wanting to get everything halal, right? But again, it's the ignorant. It's the not digging deeper and having a deeper understanding of the basic concepts and the basic traditions and what is the purpose of doing it that people misconstrue or confuse the practice with something evil or harmful to nature. On the contrary, the idea is we're maintaining an equilibrium. Right. I always say, have you ever seen a lion, a tiger, a leopard who's a vegetarian? Right. That's why in our prayers we say ekunjen. When we pray and we've slaughtered an animal, we say ekunjen. The leopard comes and claims its food. Right. The idea of the sacrifice to sustain another life. Right. It's part of the natural order.
Thank you for that. That's very good. Sorry, Jean. Go for it.
No, I was going to say, as I'm listening to this, I've done my own research before in preparation for the podcast. And I'm realizing now that I'm sitting here that a lot of the sensationalism of Yoruba or Ifa divination is specifically linked, like in movies, they call this is Santeria, and they sensationalize, the animal sacrifice, right? But then there's also like movies like The Soul from Disney, where it talks about like how, it's almost like they're picking their oris and they're like, and they're doing all this stuff, but they don't connect that to Yoruba or Ifa, right? So when it's something that, is, let's say, not as out there or negative, right? They don't directly call that out and say, hey, this is a part of this belief. But when they want to sensationalize and have a negative tone to it, they try to connect the two. And I wonder why that is.
If I may just quickly, I don't want to monopolize, I'll give it to Professor, because I know he's just younger than me. I'm just going to say this tiny little bit. For me, it's always also a misconstruing the Ifa Orisha belief system, because Ifa Orisha is not dogmatic. Ifa Orisha is not a system of control.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's destiny is unique. Everybody only reports really to Olodumare, to the Orisha that accompanied them to Earth, to their Ori, and to their ancestral spiritual guide, or Egun Elemi or Joto. They're the ones responsible for the divine mission or divine purpose of the person. So there's no pope. There's no, imam. There's nothing can tell you based on a doctrine or a canon, right? A series of laws. As we've said from the beginning, Ifa is flexible. Ifa adapts to the natural order of things and to what you came to do in this world. And that, by definition, is subversive. Because instruments or institutions that try to control, to brainwash almost, to control and hold a person into a particular way of thinking without flexibility, that can be very dangerous and very scary, right?
Right.
Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, well, this is another one. I get students ask me this all the time because, they come into my classes. Most of them have very little exposure to African or Afro-diasporic religions. And then when they actually learn about what they are, they're like, how on earth did I get this particular view of them that's terrifying when the reality is completely different? There's such a huge gap between them. There's like, how did the wool get pulled over my eyes? And so, we could talk about this literally until the cows come home. But I think to very much simplify it, at first when European colonial powers got involved in the slave trade and were doing that along the western coast of Africa, so West Africa and West Central Africa, at first they said that Africans didn't have any religion whatsoever. Africans, for a number of different kind of mostly philosophical reasons, which then got tied to the economic and political order that was necessary to sustain colonialism. Europeans needed to be advanced and Africans needed to be primitive. The whole world order was kind of established on that. And so Europeans had the light of Christianity and religion, and Africans existed in a kind of lower state of evolution, where perhaps there was superstition, but nothing that came close to religion. And that was used to justify the slave trade and a whole bunch of other things. And it was, of course, just purely racist and complete nonsense. As colonial rule got established both on the continent in Africa, but interestingly, it actually happened first in diaspora because they had established, plantation economies where they had African people and their descendants continuing to practice these traditions. They realized there's actual power here. And there are systems. It's actually very organized. You could call it works differently, but you could even call it theologies. There are sacred figures. There are, a whole bunch of things that you can't really dismiss quite so easily. So you couldn't ignore it anymore. And in fact, you actually felt the need to control it because if not, it was very, very powerful. So you had to have terms for exactly what they were and identify them as something like religion, but then they became primitive religion.
Right.
And if you acknowledge that there's reality and perhaps power to it in that particular kind of white supremacist interpretation of Christianity, because not all Christianity has always been like that. There are forms of Christianity in Egypt and Ethiopia that are kind of indigenous to Africa that don't operate this way. The only option they really had in recognizing actual power being there, and you can find it all over colonial records. They were very, very clear on the fact that real stuff is going on here. It had to be demonic, right? They'd say it's not, we can't recognize it as Christianity because it's not. And if we believe that Christianity is the only true thing in the world, if there is something else, it has to come from the devil. And then it was recognized as demonic. And the Haitian Revolution was the thing that really solidified that. The power of Haitian Vodou and working with the Loa, as they're called in Haiti and in Vodou, literally overthrew the French's control over the most profitable colony in the world at that point in time. They defeated the French twice, they defeated the English, and they defeated the Spanish. And this sent the colonial powers into like a frenzy all over. The English speakers, the Portuguese speakers, the French speakers, the Spanish speakers, they were terrified of what might happen as a result of this. So you start getting laws passed against these things. So African religions were then illegal, got solidified that they were demon worship because they were outside of Christianity, but also because they were inherently subversive. They had a strong tendency to upend the whole order of things, economic, political, white supremacist, and every way you could possibly think about it. And so they've been systematically marginalized and maligned, sometimes kind of intentionally, but oftentimes, I might say unintentionally, by people who just have been taught to fear it, and that's the way that they view it. And then very sincerely, they worry that this is all evil. I mean, I grew up mostly being afraid of a lot of these traditions, but I spent time with people who practice them and realized, like, oh my goodness, this is nothing like what you see in these movies. It's the exact opposite. I feel a lot safer in many ways with a babalao than I would with my many pastors. But it usually takes somebody actually having a genuine interaction with practitioners, actual practitioners, and not just a projection of them. It's the scholar Joseph Murphy who wrote a really brilliant article on the difference between Black religion and Black magic. Black magic being this imagined, superstitious, very dark and demonic thing that Africans, their descendants, and their traditions are supposed to be or represent. Hollywood loves it, and it gets, it's all over the place, but it usually has very, very little to do. It has only a tenuous link to what the actual practices and traditions are. So anyway, I'll stop there because I could just kind of keep going on forever about where all of this comes from, but those are some shorter points on why we have this huge disparity between people's perceptions and then what the reality actually is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Eddie.
I wanted to take a step back as, we're talking about Yoruba, we're talking about Ifa divination, we're talking about Oris and Orisha and Olodumare. And sometimes, like, when I hear all of these words all together, it's hard for me to kind of break that apart. So for the listeners out there, I'm gonna take a stab at it, Baba. And you let me know where I go wrong, because I may. So Olodumare is the ultimate creator.
Olodumare, yeah.
Then you have Olodumare. Then you have the Ori, which is your destiny, right? And then you have an Orisha, which is the go-between between you and Olodumare. And they are, am I saying it right?
Olodumare, yeah.
Olodumare. So you have the Orisha that is kind of the in-between between yourself and the creator, right? And then the Orisha is either, it could be a priest, a prophet, a deity, that kind of helps you to attain your destiny, which is your Ori, that you chose yourself prior to coming to existence. Is that correct?
Oh, okay, so let me just decompose. So I'll use sort of more Western terms people maybe from the audience may be more familiar with in English. So Ori by many has been defined as the soul, where the soul of the person represents the repository of destiny. So imagine that your soul, and the idea of, we're soulmates, or I have a destiny, I have, that is encapsulated in the soul or the Ori. When the spirit goes down and they choose their head, they choose their destiny, they choose their Ori. What comes down is an Emi, a spirit which has to fulfill a mission, learn something from this world, and they choose their head, their Ori, which embodies or encapsulates their destiny. And then they have travel mates. They come down with them. They choose this in heaven, in front of Olodumare and Orumila, which is Eleri Ipin Ibikeji. Eleri Ipi meaning witness to destiny. What did that spirit and soul, what was chosen, what was the divine mission that they chose before they came to earth? Then depending on the destiny and all that destiny within Ifa is encapsulated or described within one of the 256 odus and multiple paths of Ifa that help to explain or narrate what that destiny or purpose they came down to earth with is. The Orisha is a go-between, almost very, very similar in some constructs to as well to the idea of a guardian angel or a saint within the, like, let's say, a Catholic or a pantheon, where the Orisha is a person or is a being that may have had corporal life, may have started off as a divine being that took on or had an existence or a stage of life on earth to acquire knowledge, experience, and to fulfill its own destiny. And it comes together with your Ori as a guide, a protector, to make sure you stay on course. So in other words, that your soul doesn't deviate or get into trouble. Its mission is in charge to, together with other Orishas that may be sympathetic or vibrate at the same frequency as your soul or your Ori and its mission, they are sympathetic, so they come to protect, they come to guide, they come to impart their own wisdom and nudge you in the right direction when you need help, right? So from that standpoint, and then the things like your ancestors also come to also help you or to continue a collective mission that a particular family lineage and all that may have had, and in terms of perpetuating their traditions, their knowledge, their ancestral knowledge, as those souls and spirits have come down through those bloodlines or those lineages. The only other factor which is more prevalent within Vodun, Fa, or Fagbasa in terms of Benin, is the concept of the ancestral spiritual guide, which is not necessarily a blood ancestor, quite often is not, but is a spirit which has had many incarnations, many atunwa, and is your pathfinder. He's your guide. He's the one whose life experience or multiple incarnations has allowed you to guide you or to steer you in the right direction, to lead you until you're more cognizant of what your destiny was. What in Spiritism, and Humphrey will probably do guia espiritual. My mother, who was an amazing elegum, and she was a researcher with Don Fernando Ortiz. My mom always would say, "Mijo, always pray, always keep in mind Olodumare, o sea, el creador of all things. Tu ángel de la guarda, your Orisha, the spirit that is there to protect you, and your guía espiritual. Your guía espiritual, your spiritual guide, is the one that helps you sort of also stay on the, and is also more empathetic to the human condition, because they're closer to the human condition, right?" Yeah. So I hope that helps. It doesn't make it more complicated.
No. It totally clarifies it for me. Thank you. So Professor Deji, so we talked a lot in length about these 256 sacred texts, right? We've said it could be akin to like an encyclopedia of verses. How does the ancient text engage with modern like ethical issues now? And what would you say sets Ifa apart from something like astrology or tarot, which often feels more focused on personal guidance rather than community or ancestral wisdom?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I want to make sure that I have it, the kind of two parts to it. I want to make sure I have them straight. The first one is how does Ifa kind of respond to kind of modern issues and concerns? And then the second part is how is it perhaps a bit different from tarot or astrology? So the first one, people oftentimes say that Ifa contains all of life. And, I like to say there's nothing new under the sun. Ifa operates on a level really like outside of time. So to go back to this myth, Baba Jean Jerome said, Ifa, one of its praise names, Orunmila, the Orisha who founded Ifa divination, Orunmila is called Eleriknin, right? The one who witnesses everybody's choice of destiny. Orunmila was there at the beginning of the whole universe, watching it all unfold. And what that means really is that Ifa and Orunmila kind of exist outside of time on a kind of more abstract, spiritual or cosmic level. And then all of the different signs, the 256 different Odus, represent all of the different possible combinations of cosmic forces. And so Ifa understands how all of them can come together and have come together and combined with each other and what kind of results that produces. And so there's nothing really new that can happen in the world that Ifa hasn't already witnessed from the very beginnings of everything's existence and can see the kind of beginning from the end, right? Because it's, again, kind of outside of time. So responding to modern things is every bit as easy as it is responding to older things. It does require the good work of a Babalawo who can interpret the verse of Ifa that governs or explains what cosmic forces are at play there, right? And then can take that kind of archetype of like, okay, cosmically, this is what's going on. We understand it on that level now. How does that translate to the lived experience of the person sitting in front of you? So a good Babalawo will listen to what the person is going through. We'll have memorized this verse, and then we'll say, look, these are the ways that I think it can apply to you. And you actually have a conversation. You have a bit of a back and forth to figure out exactly what it is that's going on. And then you can respond in that way. People turn to Ifa for all kinds of modern issues, like finding a job. I'm having problem. I have a friend who was having problems with her car and turned to Ifa for it because, like, I keep taking it to the mechanic and nobody has any idea what's going on. But it's dangerous. It just shuts off, right? And Ifa can let you know what's going wrong with your car. Ifa helps people with, we were just talking a little while ago about court cases. I know of another case of somebody in Europe who called the Araba, the Ifa priest that I work most with in Nigeria, who had a custody battle over, custody of his child. And he thought his child was being unfairly kind of taken from him. And Ifa says, okay, this is how you need to navigate the legal system. There's really nothing you can bring to a good Babalawo and Ifa that it can't respond to. And it's amazing the way that they can take these stories, proverbs, songs, the kind of oral corpus or material of Ifa that in many cases is hundreds or thousands of years old. And then it's like, well, this is what it's telling us about this thing. And it's scary how precise and accurate it can be at times. The leaning into the other answer, but kind of bridging the two of them, Ifa also doesn't just respond to individual issues. You can consult Ifa about collective issues. So something that's going on in a family, in a group, a company, a workplace, a group of friends. Ifa regularly is consulted for like matters of state traditionally, in on a regular basis, the global Ifa community issues like a reading of the year, says this is the sign that's come up and is telling us this is what, as a global community, the whole world, all of humanity, whether you practice Ifa or you don't, these are the kinds of things that you're going to be facing. And so Ifa operates literally on every level of existence, which makes it also, very, very unique, I think, in that way. With respect to tarot, one of the really fascinating ways in which I think they're actually quite similar is Ifa works with narratives. Ifa gives you a narrative that's kind of almost like a cosmic script for what's going on with the issue at hand. And tarot also does a similar thing by kind of constructing a narrative based on the cards that are selected. I think the difference is Ifa is very much rooted to this idea of seeing someone's Ori or destiny and being a mouthpiece for the deities to give you that information directly in a very highly personalized way. And beyond having the 256 Odu or signs, each one of them has a potentially endless number of verses in it. So it's inexhaustible. People compare it to the Bible or the Quran, but Ifa is always expanding, and there's no way for any one person to actually know all of it, and it's constantly evolving. And so the wealth of information and knowledge that Ifa has is something that tarot, and I don't mean to disparage it at all, but it can't bring that full force of weight of ancestral knowledge to bear the way that Ifa certainly can. Astrology hasn't always been understood in this way, but I think in contemporary settings, people tend to view it almost as kind of mechanistic. So like, this is, the sun is rising in this particular sign, and so this is what's going to happen. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. There are a lot of Ifa practitioners who are also very interested in astrology and might practice it very well. But if the worldview that undergirds Ifa is one that's relational rather than kind of mechanistic. So everything is personified. So there are different spiritual forces at play, but the way you interact with them isn't by saying, okay, well, if A, B, and C, then D, E, and F. It's, well, this is a person. If you insult the person, the person isn't going to be happy with you. But it's not kind of mechanistic. There's some things out of alignment here if there's a problem. And so this is what you do to establish right relationship. And once you've established right relationship, everything will flow the way that it's kind of supposed to. So it has a bit of a different viewpoint, even on like stars, which stars are the moon or the sun, which the moon and the sun in particular have been conceptualized as Orisha themselves in some way. And as Orisha, they're not just, cosmic forces that are fixed. They're personified. They have agency. And so you interact with them. You cultivate a relationship with them, usually mediated through rituals, including Ebo or Etutu, but including a wide range of other things that you can do. And so in that way, I think it differs a lot from the way that many people today think of astrology. Historically, some people have actually thought of astrology much more in line with the way Ifa operates, but I don't think that's quite as common today.
That makes sense. Makes sense. There's an interesting part of your answer, Deji, because when you said about the 256 photos and how pretty much is all the patterns or all the combinations, cosmic combinations that can happen. One of the themes that is coming up a lot lately in other areas is this concept of patterns, right? Like we're, in economy, they're talking about patterns, and in history, they're talking about, repetition of cycles and so forth. So I'm bringing this up for our listeners to understand that there is, in fact, the concept of, look, there are infinite combinations of things that have happened, but like you said, nothing's new. Everything is things have happened before, they're going to happen again, right? It's and what I want people to take away from your answer is, look, Ifa and Yoruba can help, give guidance into situations that for us who have only, are in this plane right now, don't know, but it's already happened. It's already seen it. Maybe in a different epoch or a different scenario, but it's happened already. There's an answer to the problem, right? It's an answer to the solution. You just gotta look for the guidance. And a lot of people today are doing that in economics and history and other areas. It's time to do it in spirituality. So I think the concept that the trend is coming out is that maybe the time for Ifa to kind of expand, it's now, because people are actually in that way of looking. So with that in mind, and following on that answer, so Baba Jean Jerome, can you tell us of an experience that you've had where you had to give somebody wisdom or guidance based on Ifa divination, right? To have some sort of life challenge, right? Obviously, you don't have to mention the person or anything, but in a particular case where, Deji mentioned somebody that was looking for, the car wasn't working, something with the cords. But can you give us an example of something that happened that was kind of like life-changing that you were able to provide that?
Have countless examples. Again, over the last 16 years, I've consulted, and I keep an archive, almost like a patient files, for over 3,000 consultations and individuals. So health-wise, for instance, situations where, one example, a person hospitalized multiple times over a 2-3 month period, doctors, constant nausea, vomiting, almost like a medical, diagnosis or description, and basically not knowing what to do. Doctors saying, "Look, we're going to have to go and do an invasive surgery because all the tests, ultrasound, CT scans, everything else comes out negative. Blood work comes out negative, but you're sick. You cannot keep food down, and you're debilitating yourself. Person is referred to me, and person actually throws up right beside the consultation table, and I said no problem because I know you're here, no problem. We clean almost like a hospital.
Yeah.
And we begin to divine. And one particular situation where Ifa determines that the person has been exposed to witchcraft or poison. And that the reason why the doctors cannot find a solution is because they've been exposed to the witchcraft. Ebo is prescribed. In this case, it involved blood sacrifice, tutu. We did the Ebo. Person went back to the hospital. Not one more time did they vomit. Not one more time. And the doctor said, "What did you do?" Right?
Wow.
In other situations that we've consulted a person comes, and I always tell people, when you come to consultation, it's not what necessarily you want to know, or you think you came for a reason to know one thing, but Ifa is always going to tell you what you need to know. So that makes me sometimes a little unpopular because I don't sugarcoat it, and I tell the person straight what Ifa is saying. So I've had a situation where a person comes for a work matter, and Ifa says, you're worried about your work matter, but you have to go to the doctor, like leaving here, you have to go tomorrow, set up an appointment, you need to have blood work, you need to do a cardiogram and everything up because Ifa says you're in risk of death from heart attack. And the person looks at me like saying, well, what do you mean? I feel fine. I came here for your work issue and so forth. Basically the person goes to follow up, actually listens to the advice of Ifa, checks himself in at an emergency and saying, look, I don't, they do the workup, and the person was basically at the threshold of having a massive heart attack because his veins, 85 to 90% of his arteries were plugged. Right? Other situation where he finds, diagnosis or warns about cancer, right? Person has, if says the person, you're worried about this situation, but you have to go to the doctor because you have to have these steps because you have cancer. And the cancer is this, and this, and this. If you do have Bo, you'll be able to catch it in time. If you go now, you'll be able to catch it in time. Other situations warning about imminent accidents or misfortune at work or or legal matters. There's so many examples at so many different levels that but usually people that's why we record from my practice. I record everything so the person have a history of what Ifa said. Right? What were the messages of Ifa? And people review it, and then they say 3 months. Oh, Baba, you told me about this situation was going to happen in my family, and I didn't believe you, or I thought there was no problem, and then it's happened, and examples like that, countless. And for the mechanic, I have one goddaughter. I consult Ifa, says, there's this advice for your work. This, by the way, when you leave here, don't drive your car other than getting home today. Take your car immediately to the mechanic because your brakes are going to fail and you're going to have an accident. She looks at me like, well, what do you mean? The next day, she was able to take the car in. The mechanic says, how did you know your brakes were about to fail? If you had had a serious need to brake, you would have basically crashed because your brakes were about to fail. So she uses the analogy, father mechanic. but interestingly, Ifa is a mechanic of life.
Yeah, right.
And all its manifestations, right? Ifa covers every aspect of humanity, of the human experience, right? And it adapts. Okanaro, the land that you go, do what you see. It adapts and modifies its language to explain the current situation, but the fundamentals, the essence, the archetypes are all there.
Sorry. No, I love that answer because it ties to what you mentioned at the beginning and the core principles. It's all about the holistic health of the human, right? It's all looking at the person holistically and how do they help. So if sometimes they go for something else, it's going to tell them what they need, which is lovely, right? If you think about it, it's to help that human person move forward with their destiny.
And then what I love about Ifa again is the fact that it holistic in the sense that it deals with the understanding that the human condition, the material and the spiritual go hand in hand.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Huge thank you to Baba Jean Jerome and Professor Deji for sharing this sacred wisdom with us. If there's one thing we hope you take away today, it's this. Spiritual traditions like Yoruba and Ifa have sustained communities through centuries of change, offering frameworks for understanding that remain profoundly relevant today.
What strikes me most is how these ancient traditions contain such sophisticated systems for navigating uncertainty. We spend years trying to understand the human condition, but often dedicate so little time to understanding spiritual frameworks that could transform our experience of life. And this is just the beginning of our exploration. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into specific insights for the remainder of 2025 and discover practical applications of Yoruba wisdom for personal growth. The knowledge we've received today forms the foundation. Next time, we'll build upon it.
If you've been intrigued by today's conversation, I encourage you to sit with these concepts before our next episode. Consider how these perspectives might complement your existing frameworks for understanding yourself and the world around you. Whether you're a dedicated spiritual practitioner or simply curious about diverse ways of knowing, we invite you to join us for part 2. Our journey of exploration continues as we translate ancient wisdom into practical guidance for modern life.
Until next time, this is Jean and Humphrey signing off. Stay connected, stay kind.